Good evening. Thank you for tuning in to the Injustice Anywhere radio program. My name is Bruce Fisher. I'm the Executive Director of Injustice Anywhere. We are an all-volunteer organization working to correct wrongful convictions. We have now developed a network of websites all working to bring more attention to wrongful convictions. You can view our main website at injustice-anywhere.org. You can also Google Injustice Anywhere, and you should see our main website right there at the top of the page. We currently have 8 featured cases. Those cases are detailed on our homepage. When visiting, you will find links to Facebook and Twitter. Please like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter in order to keep up with current events. Before we get started tonight, I wanted to mention that I took the Ice Bucket Challenge today for ALS awareness. I was challenged by my nephew, and I was happy to participate. I'm sure you have seen the videos online. I also nominated a few good people to take the challenge along with me that our listeners are sure to recognize, so please view that video on our Injustice Anywhere Facebook group page. And I encourage people here tonight to also visit alsa.org to learn more about ALS and to consider making a donation. Tonight we'll be discussing the David Thorne Case with advocates Sue Gless Thorne and Lynne Blanchard. David Thorne was convicted in January of 2000 and sentenced to life without the possibility of parole for allegedly hiring an acquaintance to kill his son's mother in March of 1999. David has proclaimed his innocence from the beginning, and his supporters contend that there is overwhelming evidence that he was falsely arrested and wrongfully convicted. Tonight we will discuss that evidence. We will be taking calls in the final segment of the show, so please call in with any comments or questions. The number here is 347-850-1478. That's 347-850-1478. I would now like to introduce our guest to the show. Hi, Sue. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Bruce. Thanks for having me.
Hi, Lynn. Welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Bruce. Glad to be here.
Lynn is a returning guest to the show. She is a wrongful convictions advocate. She also writes on our website, wrongfulconvictionnews.com. I recommend that you take a look at her articles there. Her work began, I believe, with the Brad Cooper case in North Carolina. Please visit justiceforbrad.com to learn more about that case. Lynn also has an excellent blog that can be found at stopwrongfulconvictions.wordpress.com. Now, Sue, this is your first time on the show, so can you tell our listeners how you became involved in the David Thorne case?
Yes, I knew David before this all began. I was kind of a first-person involvement in the situation before there was a case, in that when he found out he had a child, when he found out the child was his, I met the child. And then tragically later when there was a murder, I was informed about that just because it involved David and his family, and they were customers of mine. I worked at the local post office where they lived, and they would come in and tell me what was happening. So I didn't go to the trial. I did not know a person could go to a trial they were not involved in. That's how little I knew about the legal system. So I did not get involved at that point. It was after he was convicted, David's grandmother called me and asked me, what are we going to do? And that's where I became involved.
Okay, and you've certainly learned a lot about the system since that point, have you not?
Absolutely. Yes, I certainly have. You just start, when you get involved in something like this, you start by becoming informed. So I gathered all the information available. What wasn't available to me through the family, I went to the courthouse and got. I copied everything, and I read everything, and I knew instantly there was something wrong. I could see it a mile away, as anybody could that looked at it. And once I got to that point, I started looking at the names in the trial transcripts and thought, well, let's go see what they have to say. And I interviewed everybody, and started finding out.
From what I've seen,
stories.
You've done extensive work on the case over the years now, and you've done a great job helping to bring the story forward. I hope tonight we can inform a few more people about the case. I'd like to start all the way at the beginning because this is a case that we do not have featured on our website currently, and it's not a case that we've profiled. I'm hoping that after the show tonight that we will be able to profile this case on our website. We do have cases that we profile that we believe in, that our group isn't quite big enough now to feature more cases than we currently have. I'd certainly like to highlight this case on the site, so I hope tonight we gain some interest. Lynn, can you tell us a little bit about the crime scene? I know there's many details we'll get into tonight, but What was the scene as the police were presented with when the victim's body was discovered? What did they find?
Basically, they found Yvonne. It was a very bloody scene. Her throat had been slashed. There were some odd things about the scene. There was the dog, who was kind of known to be an aggressive dog, was tied out. None of the neighbors complained of any barking. There are some things that seem to point to a personal crime for that reason. The dog, if he was tied out, he couldn't have been tied out all night, or I mean, she couldn't have been tied out all night, or somebody would have surely complained about the noise. The dog had recently had puppies, and the puppies were found on the outer deck outside where Yvonne's body was. So the female dog would have been certainly carrying on. And another thing, the children, she had 5 children total, 4 that lived in the home, and they were aged 1 to 6, I believe. Is that right, Sue?
Yes.
Okay. So the 4-year-old or the 6-year-old and the 2-year-old were in a room locked in. They would typically, or Yvonne would typically lock them in at night. They were in their pajamas and unharmed. The baby was in a crib upstairs. But the 4-year-old was, loose in the house. He had no blood on him. He was fully dressed and clean, and shoes on and tied. So that was unusual too. And nobody has ever really talked much about that, that aspect of this case. What else about it?
So how many children were in the house at the time?
4.
4 were in the house. And where did this crime take place?
It was at Yvonne's house in Alliance, Ohio.
Alliance, Ohio.
Mm-hmm.
And is David Thorne, is he currently in prison in Ohio? What's the name of the prison?
He's at the London Correctional Institute in London, Ohio, which is outside of Dayton. It's a little east of Dayton, between Columbus and Dayton, and he is serving life without parole. He's in he started year 16.
How did he become a suspect?
They originally decided that the victim had several children by several dads, and everyone knows that they go to the family first, the love interest or whatever, and he had a child by this woman, and he was not currently involved with her publicly. I guess they had a clandestine relationship, and he was with another girl at the time, but he was sneaking over and visiting Yvonne. And when he got involved with his son, he wanted to be involved with her as well. And so he was the father of Brandon, the 2-year-old at the time. And so when one of the dads was dead, one of them was in prison. I mean, everybody was, and the rest of them, I think two of them may have been dead, but one of them was well-known. His dad was well-known and the richest guy in town, and they never even asked him a question. So they just, once they got a hold of David, they kind of focused there and left everyone else hang. So
Sue, there was 4 children with 4 different fathers?
That's my understanding. I have not seen paternity tests. The reason they knew David was a father, he didn't know he was a father. The child was nearly 2 when he found out. He found out in 1998 before this happened in 1999. And he had been unaware that she was pregnant until the court petitioned. She was on welfare for all the children, and the court said it's time these dads raised these kids and took them off our books. And so they asked her for names of the fathers of the children, and she came up with 2 names for Brandon's dad, 2 possible fathers, and the one father refused to take a paternity test, but David went and took it. But he said when he got there he didn't need to test. The child looked just like him. He said, he's mine, clearly.
But he willingly took the test.
Supporting. Oh, absolutely, and he started supporting him before that.
So initially, there was nothing sinister about him being questioned. He was clearly connected to the victim because they had a child together.
Oh, correct. When he heard there was a murder, he didn't wait to be asked in. He went in and gave a statement because he said, whatever I can do to help, I'm willing to do.
So he fully volunteered.
Yes.
Now, Lynne, I've read a couple of your articles on this case.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a clear alibi in this case. David had an alibi, correct?
That's correct. Yes, he was.
And what was his alibi?
He was at it was called I think it was called shoot fighting. It was some type of was it like a karate kind of thing or something?
Martial arts, yeah.
Martial arts, yeah. So, and that was verified. There were other people there with him. So after time went on, this turned into it. They had to find a co-conspirator, and then what I believe is framed Joe Wilkes.
Now, Joseph Wilkes comes into the storyline. What was his acquaintance with David?
Well, they were friends, not close friends, but I think that David kind of, I don't know if I want to say he kind of mentored him a little. I think he kind of felt sorry for him, is the way it sounds. He helped him out at one point, helped him purchase a car, but they weren't close. I don't think that David, wanted to, hang out with Joe all the time. Joe was kind of immature, but in this crime, this murder for hire, there is absolutely no evidence linking David and Joe in any involvement in this crime at all. In fact,
how did Joe even become the person that they went to? Did they question a number of friends of David's, or did they key in on this Joseph person from the start?
No, he came in. They didn't figure Joe out until, I would say, July, which was about 3 months later. And I think it was just a process of elimination. They approached some of David's other friends and tried to see if anybody could be coerced into talking or implicating him in some way, and nothing happened. Well, there were some police records of Joe with David. There was an incident with a rock was thrown at a car, windshield was broken or something, and I believe Joe accused David of doing it. And Sue, can you talk about this, because you know the details better than I do?
Yeah, they were at what is a very small town, and they were at the Circle K store. It's just a little convenience store, and there was 2 cars full of kids, and they got in a disagreement. A window was broken. Everybody says Joe broke it, but when they went to Joe's house and said, okay, we heard you broke the window, he goes, no, it was David. And David said, yeah, no, it wasn't. But David ended up getting blamed for it, and he did the community service for the window. And Joe went on his happy way. So clearly Joe is someone who passes the buck. I mean, he's had this reputation because that's what he does. He gets out of blame for himself or whatever. So if I don't know if I would want to partner up with someone like Joe Wilkes and commit a crime. I mean, goodness, he's clearly not
right.
reliable.
Now, what was the theory? What was the theory that was put together by investigators that included Wilkes as the killer? How did they put that together?
They basically said that David hired him for $300 to kill Yvonne because he didn't want to pay child support and he wanted custody of Brandon. Well, he never even asked for custody. For one thing, David didn't have any financial issues. He had plenty of money. He had a huge savings account. So that is kind of a ridiculous theory that money was an issue or a motive. Basically, there was no motive.
Where did the $300 figure come in then?
Well, they looked at his bank transactions and they couldn't find any, sum of like a big withdrawal. So they went back all the way to, I believe, November of 1998 to find a $300 transaction. So that's where the $300 came up. They were really scraping to find.
That's how they came up with the $300.
Yeah.
It was about
that's
the car.
Very interesting.
That's what he loaned Joe to buy the car. He bought him a junker car for $300 and fixed it for him so he would have transportation because Joe was always walking through town and didn't have a way to get to work or anything. So
okay.
$300
2 years prior to the murder?
No, it was a few
months.
Like
6 months, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
And he loaned him $300 to buy the car. So when they get Joe and they're telling him, David's saying you did it, you got to turn on David, then Joe's going, well, once he gave me $300, so ding, there's the $300, and they couldn't find $300 except for the past November when he took $300 out of his bank account, despite the fact that he took money out of his bank accounts all the time because he worked on cars all the time, and he takes $500, $200, $300, but they had to find $300. And it took him.
Okay. So Joseph Wilkes was a friend of David Thorne. Now, Sue, let's detail a little bit of his interrogation. They bring him in for questioning, and from what I see, it didn't take them long to extract a confession. How did that all go down?
They brought him in, and he said they chained him to the wall. They spit on him. They got in his face. They said, we're going to convict you for this, and we're going to light you off like the 4th of July in Ohio's electric chair. And they described what happens to your body when you're electrocuted. And he was 18 years old. He was terrified. He might have been 19 by that time, but he was terrified. And they said, David's in the next room. He's telling us everything. He's asking for immunity against prosecution in order to give you up. We know you didn't do it. We know he did it, but he's saying you did it, and guess what? We're cutting him a deal. And Joe felt betrayed and lost, and he said, well, if he's going to lie on me, I'll lie on him. And so that's how it all happened. He started, he repeated back to them. He called himself Joe in his interrogation because he's reading from a script.
David's conviction was secured 100% on this confession. Was there any other evidence whatsoever?
No, there's no evidence linking them, and there's no physical evidence. Joe, there was no DNA at the scene that they found of Joe's, no prints, no blood. He allegedly stayed at this Comfort Inn in Alliance, walked 3.9 miles to Yvonne's house, did the murder, and then walked back to the hotel in the same bloody clothing, took no extra clothes with them. The clothing had no blood on it. What they found, allegedly the pants that he wore that night. Nothing on them. The jacket, he was allegedly wearing a white jacket, and it still was at the house where he was staying. There was no blood on it. There was no blood in David's car. I don't believe Joe was even in Alliance that night. I don't believe he was there. I think they manufactured the hotel, the Kmart knife purchase, everything. The informant seeing him at the mall, because none of it makes any sense. And there's just no physical evidence. There should be some evidence. Somebody should have seen a bloody guy walking down the street that night. There's nothing. So
from the photographs I've seen, this is a pretty bloody crime scene.
Yes.
They claim that they had the clothing he was wearing that night, and there's not a speck of blood on those clothes. That's pretty telling.
Right, and he would have still had the same shoes on, and he got into David's car. Supposedly, David picked him up that morning from the mall and drove him to the Enoch's house where he was staying, which that is unverified as well, because David was working that day, and he wouldn't have had enough time to do what they allege. But, yeah, there should have been all kind of blood and physical evidence connecting Joe to the crime if he did it. He didn't do it, and I'm sure you read Brent Turvey's analysis.
I have.
Yeah, and
now was the knife recovered at the scene?
No. After the interrogation, Joe told them the pants are in this yard of a friend's house, and it wasn't even near where the murder took place. And then the knife was in a yard of Linda. Linda was Yvonne's, would have been mother-in-law if they were married, but it was her boyfriend's mother. Okay, her friend. Sorry, I don't want to get too confusing here, but the knife was found in this corner lot, and it wasn't in a grate where you would be able to see it. The typical storm drain is usually on the road, and there's like a big gap. It wasn't in one of those. It was in this like square one in the grassy area of this yard, and there's no way he would have seen that at night, but they said that the knife was found in there. And then they went right over there, and they showed there's pictures of the police digging it up, and they get the knife. Well, there's no fingerprints on it, no blood on it. So that was supposedly.
How were they led to that area to find the knife? Was there any explanation for that?
Joe told them. They said that Joe told them where it was through it.
Joe said that he did not tell them.
Joe said that he did not tell them?
He said, they took me to the knife and said, this is where we're going to find your knife. The same guy that chained him to the wall and spit on him, put him in a car alone with him while the other ones followed behind in a different car. And they said, this is where you're going to find your knife. And Joe said, whatever. And they dug up two knives. And they said, this is the one. And he said, so, okay, whatever. He knew he was going to jail at that time. He didn't care.
Now,
he didn't care what they
said.
So through the course of the appeals, has Joe stood by his story?
He recanted within months he would have recanted sooner, but nobody asked him the question. He didn't write his own confession. They wrote it for him. And when I contacted him, he ignored me because he thought I was going to berate him for picking on David or something. I just wanted to know his story. And I sent him a piece of paper that it was a police summary report that said the immunity thing, that he thought David had asked for immunity against him, and this report said that David had asked for immunity, and David hand wrote on it, "What is this? I have no knowledge of this." And he didn't know anything about the immunity request. So I sent that to Joe, and he called me, and he told me that he had made the whole thing up, and I wrote an affidavit and sent it to him, and he signed it.
Now, Sue, give us a little history on the appeals process. From what I've heard, his appeals are currently exhausted unless new evidence is found. Where did the appeals go wrong? Because if he recanted, what was left?
The appeals went wrong with the attorneys. We had attorneys we were indigent, and then we had a court-appointed attorney who took me in, listened to what I had to say, and I knew very little about the case at that time other than the little bits and pieces that I already read. And he wrote his appeal off of my word. He didn't investigate it at all. And then from him, we hired 2 attorneys out of Cleveland, and they told us from the day they started, we're not going to win this until we get to federal court, so don't even count on it. And they filed every appeal along the way that they had to file, but they were all turned down. They weren't very well done. They, instead of putting references or quoting law in the document, they'd write attached law here and then forget to go back and put the law in. And they did a horrible job. And when we finally got to federal court, we had all new evidence that I'd discovered, and it was just so poorly presented that we just didn't get anywhere.
Didn't Brent Turvey testify?
That was a post-conviction hearing. We got a hearing, and everything we presented was things I got from knocking on doors and questioning people. And all of my witnesses showed up. They all testified, and the judge said, "No, we believe Joe." And I said, "Well, Joe's here. He is saying he lied." And they said, "Well, we believed him the first time. We don't believe him this time." So they choose when to believe someone they consider a liar. They said Joe's a liar. You got to believe the testimony of a liar. And I'm going, that's my point.
Even though everything pointed against what he said initially, and none of it fit, they decided to believe it.
What was the reasoning for the judge to reject the request for a new trial at that hearing?
He said, we're grasping at straws. Joe's a liar. They tried to dismiss Brent Turvey as they pretty much called him a hack. And the judge says, I'm admitting him as a witness, as a expert, and the prosecutor was just beside herself. She was stomping and screaming and getting into arguments with Brent on the stand. It was a horrific scene.
Their reasoning was honestly that Joe was a liar?
That Joe's a liar.
Yeah.
So how did they put any credibility in his initial statements to begin with?
Exactly.
Because it worked for them.
Yeah. We went to the appellate court. In their statement, they said David Thorne was convicted on the truthfulness of Joe Wilkes' testimony, and 3 pages later they say that Joe Wilkes' recantation cannot be believed because Joe is a liar. You can't have it both ways.
That's shocking to me. You hear these things all the time, and then there's absolutely no logic involved with those decisions at all.
Yeah.
Now, I know you both know a lot about this. I'd like to discuss a little bit about Brent Turvey's analysis and what he found, and then I'd like to look at some of the evidence at the scene that maybe points to other suspects or evidence that was ignored.
Before we do that, there's one thing I want to bring up because this is really important, so just in case we run out of time. This is one thing that nobody ever highlighted about this case. There was absolutely no communication between Joe and David preceding the time of the murder. There was absolutely no way that David could have possibly known where Joe was staying the day that he allegedly picked him up and drove him to Comfort Inn for the whole murder deal. Because they have all their phone records, they have all their pager records. And David didn't even know the Enochs, and he had no idea that Joe would be staying there. Joe didn't know he was staying there until days after he had last talked to David. So nobody ever explained it. there's no connection.
There's no communication at all between the two.
None.
Yet they somehow worked together to commit this crime.
Yep, he said he picked him up that day and that it was pre-planned. Well, when? When did they plan it? And how did he know to pick him up there? He wouldn't have known. He didn't even know the Enochs. I mean, David didn't. So that whole thing
were receipts presented for the knife purchase and for the hotel stay?
Yes, but I'm very suspect about the hotel receipt. It looks like a third grader typed it up. It just does not look like an official hotel document. I think it would be nice if someone could look at it and see if it could be authenticated, but I just don't know how to go about doing that.
What were the payment was cash at both occurrences?
Yes, right, and so that's another thing. The hotel, he could have stayed at some dumpy little hotel really close to Yvonne's house, but no, he stays 3.9 miles away, and then he gives his real name, but doesn't show any identification. Now, normally when you check into a hotel, they make a copy of your driver's license. No, there's nothing on record. The whole thing is fishy to me. Police never went and searched his room to look for blood evidence or anything. I don't think he stayed there. I don't think he was even in Lyons that night. And one could say, well, then, where was he? Why doesn't Joe just say where he was? Well, he was picked up 3 months after the fact and questioned in July. Who can remember 3 months back where they were on a particular day? I mean, not very many people. And Joe was a drifter anyhow. He stayed at all different, people's houses. He was all over the place. He could have been anywhere. He could have been doing anything. But they told him what happened, and they showed him this hotel receipt, and they showed him this Kmart receipt. And what's he going to say? How can he deny that? But if you look at the signature on that hotel receipt, it looks to me different than all of his other known verified signatures. And then also, when the police were allegedly interviewing the hotel clerk, at that very time, it was 10:30 on July 9th of 1999. At that exact same time, they have other notes that they were interviewing Chris Campbell, who was what I think is a police informant, but they said that he was at the mall and he saw Joe that day. So they couldn't have been in two places at one time. I think the whole thing was just completely manufactured, and who's going to contest it? You need experts to say, no, this receipt wasn't accurate, and it's just a very
all the receipt
battle.
would say, even if the receipt was legitimate, all it would say was that he stayed at that hotel that night.
Right.
It still doesn't link anybody to a crime. Now, you said that David was accused of picking him up the next morning. That was their suggestion. What is his alibi for that time frame? Well,
there was a payphone call from. Police said it was from Carnation Mall payphone to David's house at 8:30 that morning. But I looked at that. I looked at the actual phone bill, and that number is not the number of the Carnation Mall phone. When police went to trial, they took typed up very neatly phone numbers, and it was a different number. So I don't even think there was even a call to David's. But they said that Joe waited for David, and David picked him up at the hotel and drove him to the house where he was staying, at the Enoch's house. David at that time was on his lunch break. He went and bought McDonald's food and then went back to work and took food for everybody, and it was still warm. He wouldn't have had time to drive all the way, 20-minute drive one way to take Joe home and then back to work. It just doesn't fit.
So they claim he did it on his lunch break.
Yeah, right, or morning
so
break.
So they acknowledge that he was at work that day, but that he was able to get that accomplished on his lunch break.
Right. And again, there's no blood in his car, though, so I don't know how that, I don't know how they
His time card says he was gone a half hour, and this is an hour and a half venture. His time card says a half hour, and I don't know any bosses.
And he brought back McDonald's for others at the job.
Right.
And that's all vouched for.
Right.
Yes.
So that time frame there is completely impossible.
Right.
I talked to the person he worked with, and he said the police told them, we know he did it, but we can't prove it. We need you guys to alter his timeline to make it fit so we can get a dangerous person off the street. He told me that. And he said we did it.
Now, was this ignored at trial, or was it brought up by the defense? Or is this something that was discovered afterward?
They brought up the timeline, the prosecution did, and the defense did nothing to refute anything. They just sat there, so...
So the defense did not argue the 30-minute time frame with the McDonald's lunch. That's all information discovered after the fact.
Right. No, that was in trial. But I found out after the fact that they had lied, that they perjured themselves. They admitted to me. The one person from his work admitted to me that he perjured himself, and that was the reason why.
To help them win the case.
Yeah, because they said David was dangerous.
Now, what are the clear aspects now? What convinces you to this day that Joe was actually framed beyond extracting a coarse confession?
Well, I don't know. I mean, some people believe that he actually was in Alliance that night and that he stayed at a hotel and then went to Yvonne's. I don't believe that he was even there because there are details about that house that he doesn't know about. They asked him when he was initially questioned, what about the dog? And he said, I didn't see any dog. Well, he would have seen that dog, and it was aggressive towards strangers. So I don't know how you explain that away. He didn't see the dog, and he didn't see any either, the 4-year-old in the house. And, again, it's 4 miles each way or 3.9 miles. He
also got the entire crime scene wrong. His confession is modeled after the statement of a psychic that the police went to interview for because they couldn't pin this on anybody, so they went to see a psychic for hints about the crime. They took her bloody clothes, the victim's bloody clothes, and handed them to a psychic, unbagged, and let her handle them, and so she could get a read on the murder.
That's what I was hoping to get into with Brent Turvey's analysis.
Yeah.
I wanted to see how that compared to Joe's statements. Because
not at all.
From the articles I've read, they don't match up at all.
Right.
The only thing he got right was that she was killed with a knife. He said he bumped into her TV stand. So I'm picturing one of these tubular TV stands from the 70s or whatever that you set a TV on. It was a chest of drawers full of clothes. There's no way he would have had to step on her to get to that chest of drawers that was tipped over, and it was propped up on a baby walker so that it didn't crush her. It didn't fall forward all the way and crush her. The drawers were pulled out and leaned against a baby walker. It was clearly staged. Clearly staged.
And much
later.
later.
There was staging done at the scene after the murder, sometime after the crime took place.
Long enough for blood to have dried on the dresser.
Right. And
that
wouldn't
correlate at all with suggesting that Joe committed this crime.
Right. And also the biggest thing that Brent determined was that the blood spatter by the sliding glass window. It was clear that she was cut there and not Joe's version where he cut her throat sitting on the couch next to her, because the blood pattern just doesn't work with
so
Joe's
the location
version.
of the attack in the house itself is completely wrong compared to Joe's statements.
Right.
Yes.
Are there any other key details that he got wrong that Brent Turvey pointed out?
He said that his statement changed every time he told it. First, she said, "Why did you do this to me?" And he answered her. And then another time, I'm sure somebody explained to him, her neck was almost cut completely through. She's not speaking to you. And so he changed it to she just grunted. It sounded like she tried to say a word, that she ran into the dining room, ran back, because he had to explain all that blood. And Brent said that there's no way she ran anywhere. There's blood on the bottom of one foot, that she stepped in blood. The other foot flipped up, and the blood dripped from the person of the killer onto the bottom of her foot, but she did not take more than one step. So she could not have done all the running back and forth.
This was a brutal wound that she suffered. I'm an amateur. I'm certainly not an expert by any means, but that wound, there's no possible way she was running around anywhere.
Right, or speaking. Right.
Or speaking. So Brent's analysis was that she took one step and slipped and fell to the floor, and that was it.
And they supported her from behind and assisted her into the living room where they put her down on the floor. And you can see the blood drops from the person of the killer on the bottom of her foot, and you can see blood legs where the killer stood against her couch where she never reached. She did not get to the end of her couch. And there's blood where it looks like two legs standing there, and the killer wiped the knife off that they used to kill her on her pillow slip. So you can see the imprint of a knife, and blood lake. So the killer is bloody. Joe Wilkes was not.
Right.
Okay. So at the hearing, you have Joe had recanted his statement, and now you have an expert there that details how Joe's initial statements were completely against what was truly happening at the crime scene, so they didn't match up at all.
Right.
And the judge still concluded that,
and then there was more.
Even though Joe was a liar, that his initial statements were sound.
Right.
He said, who cares about bloody knife swipes on pillowcases? Joe Wilkes confessed. Who cares about the evidence? That's the judge's statement.
That's amazing to me. I want to remind everybody we will be taking calls in the final segment about 10 minutes from now. The number here is 347-850-1478 if you have any comments or questions. I'd really like to discuss what was ignored by police in this investigation. What evidence was at the crime scene that they should have followed up on and they didn't, that could have possibly led to another suspect? Are there any key pieces of evidence you'd like to discuss, either one of you?
The time of death, I think, is important to talk about because they really did a poor job at determining the accurate time of death. They placed it anywhere from, Sue, if I'm correct, 7 p.m. until
7 p.m.
noon.
to 12:30 the next day. The 17-and-a-half-hour window of the time of death.
Right.
Now, how come that happened? What was the reasoning for such a long, wide range of time?
Between the time a neighbor saw her and her mother found her. That's where they determined the time of death because nobody saw her in between.
And then the medical examiner didn't take the body until, what, was it the next day? Or
it was
do you remember?
April 1st at 7 o'clock, and the autopsy started 30 minutes later. They got the body and immediately did the autopsy.
And we just have very little information from that either. I mean, there are ways to determine time of death, and if they could have pinpointed it better, but they had to leave it wide open to allow for Joe. And they even said, I think they told Joe to say that he had to complete it by 10 p.m. Because that was for David's alibi, because David said that he would be at, the shoot fighting at that time or something like that. And then also another thing that came up after the fact, after the trial, was some discovery that the defense never got, and that was a witness who saw somebody leaving her house at 9:30 that morning and carrying a garbage bag. And the defense never got. His name was George Hale, and
he was a neighbor.
He was a neighbor, and he not next, but he lived in the neighborhood.
Okay.
He was walking his dog, I believe. Is that correct, Sue?
No, he was walking back from McDonald's with coffee.
Okay.
We're plugging McDonald's here tonight.
Yeah. But that was never
he heard the
evidence.
Right. And he saw someone that he described walking out the front door carrying a half-full garbage bag, and he was shown a lineup with David and Joe in it, and he said no and no. He said no to everybody in the lineup. But
so there's a witness that saw somebody leaving the residence, and the description he had in his mind didn't match either Joe or David.
Right.
They were radically different. Joe and David are both very tall, over 6 foot, and this was a 5'9", 180-pound man with medium-length dark hair, and it matches everybody else in the crime, but not David or Joe.
Did he testify at trial?
He testified at the post-conviction. They buried him at trial. They told him to get off. They better not see him in court.
Right. The defense never had that information.
So he did not testify at the initial trial.
No.
Obviously, that's the most important time.
Mm-hmm. And when he was at the post-conviction hearing, and they considered him unreliable.
He would have been much more reliable if he was heard at the first trial, at the only trial. Unfortunately, these things happen. Key evidence comes out later, and it's just dismissed outright. Now, I read here that there was a few pieces of evidence collected from the scene that could have possibly been tested for DNA, and that was never done. What are those pieces of evidence?
There's cigarette butts and 2 different ashtrays. One of the ashtrays full of cigarette butts has disappeared. They collected them, and they never made it to the lab. There was an open condom wrapper that should have been tested because clearly she had recently had sexual activity with somebody. Someone threw a handful of condoms around their bedroom floor, so there was some anger somewhere. There was a ring, an unidentified ring on her bedstand. There was a wad of chewed gum on her bedstand. There was all kinds of things that could have held DNA. There was a lighter that looked like she was sharing with somebody. Her body, the person carried her in and laid her on the living room floor. The touch DNA, I mean,
right? Even the knife swipe,
front.
right? Even the knife swipe, they could have found blood or DNA on that, and that was never tested.
Now, the
either.
prosecution's theory of the crime doesn't include somebody moving her, though, does it?
No, she did it herself. They said.
Okay.
And the judge didn't
care about it. So that might be their
feet.
reasoning for not testing that information, those possible samples. Has any DNA testing been done?
No.
No.
Nothing was tested at all at the scene.
The criminalist was asked at the trial if she tested DNA, and she said nobody asked her to.
So the knife was never processed. Nothing at all was ever tested at the scene.
It was processed for blood, and they said it was a positive presumptive test for blood because there was a protein-based substance on the little knife that they said was Joe's, and it was tested by the defense. The one thing they tested, that in his pants, and this guy said they did not call him to testify. The defense did not call him to testify, but he said there was no blood on that knife, none, and he sent that report to the defense for the trial, and they didn't use him.
They did a really poor job. I mean, and that's, I think, why we are here 15 years later, trying to still get this moving.
Now, you also mentioned in an article that there was an unidentified thumbprint on that knife.
That was a different
Was
knife.
that ever researched properly?
Actually, that was a different knife. There was a knife found on a street nearby Yvonne's house, and it seemed to match her set of kitchen knives. And I think somebody found it. How long after the crime was that?
The next day.
Okay.
The next day.
It had an unidentified
This is another
thumbprint
completely different knife that was found in the street just by somebody passing by?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And
that knife was never tested either.
Well, go ahead.
They tested the fingerprint, and they tested against David and Joe, and it wasn't them. They tested against her parents and some other people that she knew, and it wasn't any of them. So it could still, it could still be run through CODIS again, and it's possible they could find a match. You know, there's so many things that could be done on this case.
Now, Sue, was that knife, it did match the set that was in the house, or just similar?
She had a set of 6 knives that were marked stainless Taiwan, and they matched that knife exactly, and her knife of that size was missing from her set. But they said since they're mass-produced, it could be anyone's knife. The day after a woman is cut in the throat and is missing that knife from her set, it could be anybody's knife.
And there was never a blood test done on that knife?
What's that?
Was that knife tested for blood?
Test it. Yeah, there wasn't any blood on it.
Okay, just a thumbprint. But it's certainly suspicious because, like you said, it was found one day after the crime, and it's matching a missing piece from her utensil set.
It also seemed to match the knife swipe that was on the sheet, or right.
That can get a little bit more general. It
definitely seemed to match. Well, it seemed to match more than that little knife that they said that Joe threw in that drain.
Yeah, Joe's knife was a pocket knife with a 3-inch blade.
And how deep was the wound? It was deeper than 3 inches.
It was 4 inches deep. 4 inches, yeah.
Right. So, it made a 4-inch incision. A 3-inch knife made a 4-inch incision. I don't understand how that works either.
Now, I read this too. It says the victim was found with a baby picture between her legs.
Yeah.
Was that something she was possibly holding, or did it just come off of a piece of furniture in the room? What's the story about that photo?
Well, she was face down, and the picture looked like it was in a small frame. It was probably a wallet-sized photo. It looked like a baby girl. We don't know who that child is, but she had all boys, so I don't think it was one of her kids. Unless it was a boy, but it didn't look like any of her kids. And then that same picture of that same baby was in her kitchen on her microwave in a frame. It was a larger version, so that baby was important to Yvonne. And I don't know who it was, but it could have some significance to this crime, and it was never explored. It was never investigated. I guess they could just assume that it fell off the dresser or something, but the way that it was there, it just looked like somebody threw it there.
And there was more than one picture of the same baby in the house?
Yeah.
The same.
And the child was never identified.
Right. Yeah. It's an identical picture, just a larger one.
Okay.
So
we don't know who that baby belongs to.
No, it might actually be her baby picture for all we know. And maybe, if this was a personal crime, somebody might have been angry at her and threw it there in anger, so there you go, Now,
I don't like to talk negatively about anybody that's been a victim of a horrible crime like this, but she obviously had multiple relationships. Each of her children was with a different father.
Right.
Did she have any known enemies at the time?
She had many known enemies. She was, according to the police themselves, many of them were sleeping with her. She had extensive sexual activity in her life. I mean, she was. I guess she was kind of abrasive in that she would threaten people. I'm going to tell your wife you're sleeping with me. You better give me some money. Things like that were going on, is what I understand. I have no personal knowledge of that, but I've heard it from several different sources. So she was irritating people, clearly.
So there was a lot of avenues that could have been pursued if they didn't get this forced confession from Joe.
Right. Now, as far as you said about other things from the scene, another thing that's important to mention is Vinny, the 4-year-old. He did talk to family, and he said that Mommy was pushed down, and he said Jim pushed Mommy down. And did he say anything? Oh, and then he ran out the window.
And ran down the driveway.
Right. So Jimmy kind of sounds like Jeremy.
And they identified it as Jeremy.
Right. So there is a Jeremy in this story because that was Linda's boyfriend. And again, Linda is Eric's mother. Eric is the man that Yvonne was living with at the time, but he was in prison at the time. But the mother had kind of an abrasive relationship with Yvonne as well, and had recently, she was raising Vinny up until I think just weeks prior to the murder. Yvonne said, I'm taking him back, and I think it was pretty contentious. And then the murder happened.
It seems to me, nearly 15 years after the crime, if I have the time frame right, that there's currently a lot more questions in this case than there are answers.
Yeah.
I feel like there's so many things we could discuss, little branches and little stories and little side notes, because if she had that many people in her life, there were so many things that could have been investigated if Joe hadn't coerced into giving that confession. Because once they get that confession, all these other avenues are going to stop.
Right. Now, the confession, too, in and of itself, they've told him everything that he was going to say. They said to him, you stayed at the Comfort Inn. You bought this knife at Kmart. They didn't go in and ask him, what did you do on such and such night? They fed everything to him, and then he had to regurgitate it back with the threat of death.
Now, this was never recorded, was it?
Initially, the initial one wasn't. The one that they said that he said after 5 minutes of sitting there, he said, I did it. They didn't record that part. No. And then they turned the recording on. And then they said, you are, understand that you're not under arrest. Well, why wasn't he under arrest if he just admitted that he killed her? So that's why I know that was a bogus confession.
They also called him by the wrong name. They didn't get his name right. I would think at that time you'd know who you were talking to.
Right. So I think they fed him everything. I think they even maybe used notes that they wanted him to read off during the recorded interview.
Okay. There's a couple questions on Facebook from listeners. I believe the one is regarding the baby photo that was found at the scene. It says, did that photo ever get shown by the media? Is that something that was public at the time, or is it something you discovered?
I published it on the Facebook page. I saw it, and to me, it looks like someone threw it there as if to say, screw you, because it looks like it's in the position that she could be birthing that baby. I thought that was noteworthy because she had so many children. It's just a
very unique situation. It was oddly placed.
The feet are up near her crotch, and then the head's, it's the same way a baby comes out. And she had so many children and reportedly many abortions, and it just seemed like this is about a baby.
It's an interesting point, but that was never part of the media or part of the trial at the time.
Not at all.
There's another question here as well, and I know we've touched on it. Was there any proof of the transaction of money exchanging hands?
Same time of the year that David said he loaned him the car and that the money was taken out of the bank, it all correlated, and I talked to the woman who sold him the car. So there was a car, and David it was a junker for $300 clearly, and David took it and helped him fix it up because every time David would leave his house, he'd find Joe walking to his house begging for a ride. So this way it eliminated David having to cart him everywhere.
But this is several months back. Is there any explanation given for why it took Joe so long to carry out the hit?
No.
Actually, they just
at the time of the $300, he didn't even have custody yet not custody, but paternity of Brandon yet. Is that correct?
Right. They hadn't even started taking child support out yet, no.
Right. So, and that was supposed to be the motive. So that doesn't even work either.
Okay, so at the time that they say money was exchanged hands, the actual motive, the possibility for that motive hadn't even developed yet.
Right.
No.
That's interesting. So that doesn't make any sense at all.
No, it doesn't. The whole case is a complete mess.
Was David in a position where he would have been unable to pay child support?
He had $135,000 in the bank.
David did?
Yes.
Okay,
Plus,
so child support wasn't going to be a problem.
Cash. He had $6,000 cash in his sock drawer from working on people's cars, and he had his bank account and his savings account. He had money.
Because he was working, he was living with his grandfather, but he didn't have to pay rent or anything, so he just probably had everything. Right. And
was there any indication in the time prior to the murder that he was having any arguments or any disagreements?
No.
With the mother of his child?
No, and even the mother, even Yvonne's mother, said that he was a nice kid, and she liked him, and that they got along well. Nobody ever testified that there was any kind of conflict between them. And anytime he would want to see the child, he would just say, "Hey, can I see Brandon?" And she was like, "Sure." I mean, she's got 4 little kids to take care of. She was probably happy to have him off her hands once in a while. So the motive just does not work at all.
It doesn't fit. Just listening to your comments tonight, the motive doesn't fit. And the fact that they had to go back a few months just to find any transaction between 2 friends.
Right.
It's not like he found Joe out on the street and he was a total stranger to him and money exchanged hands.
Right.
He was having no financial difficulty at all, and there's nothing to show that they were having any tension between them.
No.
Even the lawyers for the child support hearing, they said that they were more like boyfriend and girlfriend than animosity between them. They got along well. They went out to lunch after the hearing.
Also, if it was a financial issue, if he's going to have the kid then full time, that's going to be a much bigger expense than paying a monthly child support.
That's an excellent point.
Yeah, that doesn't make any sense either.
The financial accusation doesn't fit at all.
Right.
No.
Now, Sue, you might be able to talk about this a little bit more. I know you have a close relationship with David. How's he holding up, and who helped raise his son after he was put in prison?
He gave his grandfather, David's grandfather, custody because he had no experience in this respect. He thought, well, I'll be out, once they figure out it's not me. And he gave him custody, and that kind of backfired on him because his grandfather tried to sever his paternal rights and take the child over. And David would not allow that. And we actually got married 6 years ago so I could offer the little boy a home other than that one. And, of course, that didn't happen because he's still there. But But the grandfather has been raising him all these years. So, and I have had no contact with him in years due to the paternity issue, because David wouldn't go along with it. He said, I've lost everything. I'm not losing my son.
And does David and his son currently have a relationship together? Are they able to communicate and or visits?
Only as much as the grandfather will allow. And so he sees him only a couple times a year because he's underage. He has to have an adult with him, and they won't let me take him. And they take him once or twice a year.
That's a very sad situation. How old is he currently?
Yeah. He'll be 18 in November.
Okay, so hopefully things might change at that point in time.
Yeah, he'll go down on his own then.
And how's David holding up? Is he doing okay?
He comes through that door with a smile on his face. Because I make him, I give him hope. I make him have hope, and all of you make him have hope, and that's the only thing keeping him alive, because otherwise this would just be more than he could bear. Having this kind of a reputation with people out here believing he did something like this, it's too much. It's so hard to bear. I put Facebook pages up for him and personal ones so his friends could write to him, and people report me and take him down, calling him a killer. I mean, how do you live with that? But he still manages to come out to that visit twice a month with a smile on his face, because he doesn't want to bring me down to where he's living.
So what hope is there now for him to get
new evidence?
Another hearing.
New evidence. New evidence. Yeah,
what could possibly come forward to help him at this point?
Somebody tell the truth.
Right, or we need DNA, something.
DNA testing, or somebody actually telling the truth.
And what happened with
really,
Joe?
we need a lawyer. We need a lawyer that can kind of put everything together that we have here, that we've compiled, and just figure out where do we go, what needs done, what can be tested. There has to be some way to do this. I know people do work on cold cases, and there has to be some way to get him out of there.
But everybody wants thousands of dollars, and I've already given up my house, and I drive a very old car because I've given everything up for this. I've spent everything I have.
It seemed like a promising time when he was granted that hearing, and Brent did his analysis. That was a shocking blow there, just from reading all of that, because that seemed like a clear-cut reason to give him a new trial.
It did. I know.
It almost feels like
what happened with Joe? What was his sentence? What deal did he cut for?
He got 30 years to life, no possibility of parole for 30 years, and then he took 30 years of life. And in order to get parole, he'd have to admit he did it, and he's never going to do that again. He's clearly done it once, but I don't know.
How did he accept? What was his reason for giving the confession if he knew he was going to jail for life, just to avoid the death penalty?
Yes.
To avoid the death penalty. And he said, I have nothing going on anyway. I have nowhere to live. Nobody will take me in. He didn't want to work. He wanted someone to just support him, and he moved from house to house, and he just decided that, well, it's 3 meals and a cot. That's what he wrote.
And this is a guy who's very immature. He had a very tough upbringing, multiple family issues growing up, and it's just a really sad story because they took advantage of him.
Sure. I thought that I read somewhere that they had told him that they had lied to him and said that he would be out in a short period of time if he cooperated.
They give him 30 years. They give him 30 years and he'd be out in 7, and he believed that, and that never happened.
Isn't that terribly sad?
So that was another way that they were able to trick him into giving this confession and to cooperating.
Yeah. Either way, you're going to jail, but you could be out in 7 years if you'll cooperate with us. And then
right. He
thinks David's
in the room. Yeah, and he thinks David's in the room next door implicating him.
David wasn't even there.
Right.
And he wasn't even in the police station at the time.
No, he wasn't. And he never implicated Joe, of course. I mean, the whole thing was made up. It's just awful.
So the bottom line is, after everything we've talked about tonight, we have David in prison for the rest of his life without the possibility of parole, based on a coerced confession from a drifter at the time that has since recanted.
Right.
Right.
The case needs an attorney that's willing to work pro bono on this case to put it all together, hopefully to get DNA testing granted or to get a witness to speak the truth, as you said, so that he could be granted at least get a hearing before, obviously they would grant a trial.
I almost would want to go back to the Alliance Police, and there are probably new people in charge there now, and say, can you reopen this? This is what we found. Please just reopen the investigation. I don't even know if that's an avenue worth pursuing or not, but I don't think there's anything to
They lash out at me online occasionally. They lash out at me and tell me they got the right guy.
Now, this is the only case that I've discussed on the show where all avenues are currently exhausted.
Mhm.
It's a very unfortunate situation.
All the new evidence we found had to be presented in the state court before it could be presented anywhere else, and that was when we were at the federal level. They had to tell her to go back to state court and do it. Instead, they allowed her to enter it at the federal level and then immediately turned her down and denied our appeal. So she entered all of our evidence at a place she wasn't allowed to enter it, and then now it's not new evidence anymore. Everything I uncovered is now it's used. If you can't enter it as new evidence anymore because she did it unlawfully.
As I sit here, I'm kind of at a loss for words because it seems like it's such a cut and dry case at this point where he would at least should have been granted a new trial, and it just seems very sad that the avenues are completely exhausted. Now, I'm sure he appealed the rejection by the court. That was quickly rejected as well?
Yes, and then his public defender, Ohio State public defender, dropped him, saying his case had no merit to carry it forward.
Okay, and the judge gave the same reasoning on that rejection that Joe's testimony was reliable the first time.
Yep.
I've actually thought about maybe Joe should be hypnotized or something so that he can talk about, what really happened, where was he at that time, and I don't think he's ever agreed to that. But, it's just really frustrating. You try to think of any possible avenue that can help these guys.
Sure.
And
I doubt anything coming from him would ever be viewed as credible. It seems to me that they need to get some DNA tested at the scene. Hopefully it would lead to another suspect because she had a lot of people in her life.
Right.
And you need a break to bring somebody else into the picture.
Right.
Now, what websites do you recommend for people to go to learn more about his case?
We have two. The website is the Wrongful Conviction of David Thorne, all that spelled out, .org, and he has a Facebook page. Again, the Wrongful Conviction of David Thorne, and Free David Thorne. He's got two Facebook pages. Actually, the website is WCODT. It's not spelled out. That was the Facebook page. WCODT.org is his, and all the information is on there. There's all kinds of information on there.
Excellent. And Lynn, you've written a couple articles on this case, and you also have a blog as well. What's the URL for your blog?
I believe it's wrongfulconvictions.wordpress.com.
Okay, I believe I gave it at the beginning, too. You have a lot of good articles in there, so people should head over there and read those articles.
I haven't updated it in a while. I'm actually working on the Cooper case. I've been spending all my time on that lately. But
the information there is never going to change. It's all factual, and it's very good. And I thank you again because I know you've written some great articles for our website, wrongfulconvictionnews.com.
Well, thanks.
So I recommend people go and take a look at those as well.
Yeah, it's a great
I wish
site.
we had more answers to the questions, but for me, currently this case has far more questions than answers, and people should really stop and think about that because when that happens, there's usually something wrong.
Right.
And this could
we have
happen
a couple
to anybody.
calls on hold that just came through, so I'd like to take those.
Okay.
The first call here, it's a 910 area code. You're on the air. Do you have a question or comment?
This is Chris Halkitis from Wilmington, North Carolina.
Hi, Chris. How are you?
Great. The DNA stuff went by. I'm sorry I came in a little late, so it went by a little fast. But it occurred to me, since this is in Ohio, have you folks tried to get in contact with Jim and Nancy Petro at all?
I have.
And what did they say?
They encouraged me to talk to the Ohio Innocence Project, which I did, and they took his case twice, but they refused it twice when they got into it because of the co-defendant, his wishy-washy testimony. They can't put any faith behind him, and without him, they they won't take David.
And they're not. I mean, I would think that a false confession accusation like this would be right up their alley.
Exactly.
Particularly
that's
when
why
some
I'm stymied.
particularly when some DNA evidence, might really bear on this question.
Well, they keep saying that the DNA evidence is not. Who's to say if the chain of custody was broke? I mean, and I say, but it's a couch. I mean, a couch with a pillowcase on it with knife swipes on it. She was killed by a knife. Explain this to me. How is that not reliable? How can we not determine it was the killer that did that?
I have to admit it's hard to wrap my mind around that. But it sounds like you've exhausted the obvious, places I would have gone for help. So I'm sorry I can't be of more assistance on that. But good luck with it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks for the call, Chris. We have one more call here. It's a 937 area code. Thank you for calling the show. You're on the air. Do you have a question or comment?
I was curious about the witness that saw someone leaving the house with a trash bag. Has that never been presented as any type of evidence? Could that be used as new evidence going forward to get some action?
We filed that evidence as a Brady violation, which means the prosecution withheld the evidence from the defense, and they clearly did. And the prosecution attacked that, saying that they didn't turn it over because they knew that the witness was unreliable. I have met the witness. I've deposed the witness, and he seems completely credible to me. And I think that's just their fail-safe for why we didn't give it to you. But that alone should have won us a new trial, and it did not.
He was in the post-conviction hearing. Is that correct, Sue?
Yes, he was. He testified at the post-conviction hearing. He signed an affidavit. As soon as he testified, the police started hounding him and chasing him around and harassing him. And every time he appears on TV on this show, on this story, again, the harassment starts. And yet he's still here. He's still saying the same thing, and he wants to be heard. And they're not believing him.
They wouldn't consider that as new evidence?
It is new evidence, but the judge turned us down, saying, no, I don't believe him.
So it's already been presented at a hearing and was already rejected.
Post-conviction hearing. It was already rejected.
At this point,
so it's no longer new evidence.
They need more new evidence than that evidence.
Correct. And the only thing
as ridiculous as that may sound.
Yes, thank you. That's exactly true.
The whole thing is just pathetic.
Yeah.
Yes.
Now, how did they keep him, George Hale? How did they keep him from the first trial?
They just did not release his name. I only found him because they accidentally left him in a summary report, just a little blurb about him at the end of the page, and I think they forgot to eliminate him from that report, and that's the only reason I know who he is. And so I went and knocked on his door, and he slammed the door on my face because he said, I've already been harassed enough. I don't need this. But I said, you know what? You came forward once. Obviously, you're a good guy. I need you to just tell me your story, and he did. And
so it wasn't even a mistake. It wasn't even a mistake made by the defense attorney. This was a clear Brady violation.
The defense did not know about this guy.
There's other discovery that the defense never got that there's interviews we've never seen. We're still trying to get that through FOIA, such as Jeremy's interview. We've never seen anything written. So I'm sure there are all kind of documents that we've never seen that are related to this case, and we're still trying to get them. But we're just, we're not lawyers or anything,
Sure. From the beginning of this conversation, I thought that witness was key. So it's an excellent point to bring up. Thank you for the call on that.
Sure.
Thank you.
Now, at this time, is there anything else we've missed on this case? Like I said, I'm sitting here thinking there's so many questions, but there just aren't answers. And when I see that, I know there's a problem with this case. Is there anything we've missed?
Well, the only thing that I have just one more thing I wanted to mention was that there were two witnesses that said that they saw Joe at the mall that night, and it was Rose Moore and Chris Campbell. I believe Chris Campbell is probably a police informant, but Rose was part of the post-conviction hearing as well because she had signed she put Joe's name on a business card and said that he gave that to them that night with his phone number on it, and it was not even close to his signature. So it was admitted that she lied about that card.
He said he met with them for a half hour and said, I'm in town, I'm going to go kill somebody, here's my name and number in case you want to contact me or like squeal on me or something. I mean, clearly that was, he didn't say that, but why would you give us, if you meant you're going to kill somebody, why would you give them your contact information for them to turn you in? That's clearly ridiculous. So the whole story's...
So it's just one more piece of evidence that, breaks down this house of cards. And
a perjured witness, that's the reason for a new trial.
Right.
Sure. And that's already been exhausted as well?
Yeah, I mean, one bad judge can, ruin it for a person. It's really hard. People don't realize when someone's wrongfully convicted, you can't just appeal it and boom, new trial, boom, acquittal.
Right, and once it's rejected, it's no longer new evidence.
Right.
Like you said, one judge can crush an awful lot of evidence.
Right.
Right.
Yeah,
it's a very unfortunate case.
He goofed up. Yeah.
Right. The post-conviction hearing had quite a bit. They had Brent's. They had this thing on the Rosemore forged card. What else? They had the George Hale stuff. So it was a lot of... Right, and the recantations. They had quite a bit of really compelling evidence to warrant a new trial.
These are 4 different ways to get a new trial, and we had them all in the same hearing, and they rejected every one of them.
And that was, what year was that, Sue?
2003.
So look how long that's been now. It's
so really at this point we're at the stage of hoping somebody comes forward that can help. Now, Who's the best person to contact? If somebody wants to come forward, if an attorney or an expert or somebody wants to get involved in this case, do you have an email or a phone number that you could give out for anybody that's willing to work on this?
Right. On the Facebook pages, there's a phone number, and it's 740-506-4767, and that comes directly to me, and they can contact me anytime with, even tips, anything. It's on the Free David Thorne page and on the Wrongful Conviction of David Thorne Facebook pages, and my contact information is on both of those pages. And
excellent.
They can go to freedavidthorne@yahoo.com and send me an email.
Perfect. I'd like to thank you both for being on the show tonight. I hope that we can bring a little bit more attention to the case. Hopefully somebody will eventually come forward. Keep pressing along. You never know who's listening, and you never know who might eventually come forward to help you. I know, Sue, you're never going to give up.
Never.
But I met you
Me
a few
neither.
weeks back. I met you a few weeks back, and I could still see how much energy you have about this case, and that's reassuring for sure. We need more people like you out there. And Lynn, you've been on the show several times, so you're just an incredible advocate for several cases. So we certainly need more of that. But I want to thank you both for being here tonight.
Thank you, Bruce.
Thank you,
I really
Bruce.
appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thanks so much.
So everybody, if you could tune in next week at the same time, you can check out our website, injustice-anywhere.org, for updates on shows. Next week we're going to be discussing the Jeffrey Havard case. There's new information about that case that is very promising, and we are really hoping for a breakthrough here. We'll be talking about that next week at the same time. Thanks for tuning in. Good night.